Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Andrew Jackson, Part 2. We stopped last time in 1813. The War of 1812 was on. That war lasted from 1812 to 1815, and it was a war between the United States and Great Britain and the British Indian allies. Now, the Indians had been, as they say in politics, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So the British and Indians had a common enemy, Americans, or European descent Americans. And Tecumseh was the great Indian leader, Shawnee Indian, trying to unite the Indian nations to stop European American expansion west. And one of the people who were inspired by him was Chief Red Eagle, who was a Creek Indian, also known as William Weatherford. He was what they called a half-breed, half Indian and half European descent. And he led the Creek Indians in an attack on American settlers in the Mississippi Territory, what's now in Fort Mims, Alabama. And 400 Americans died, including women and children. So this was the dramatic news, and Andrew Jackson and the Tennessee militia were ordered to march south to fight the Creek Indians. Red Eagle had, as I said, had been inspired by Tecumseh, who had said, "Let the white race perish. War now, war always, war on the living, war on the dead." Now, in that attack, there was a description on Americans who died, and it was written that, quote, they were, quote, butchered in the quickest manner, and blood and brains bespattered the whole earth. The children were seized by the legs and killed by batting their heads against the stockading. The women were scalped, and those who were pregnant were opened while they were alive, and the embryo infants let out of the womb. So this is tough. Well, the ongoing war between European descent Americans and American Indians. So the Tennessee militia was headed south under Andrew Jackson's leadership. Two of the officers with him were Davy Crockett, who became famous, who died at the Alamo fighting Mexico for the independence of Texas, as well as Sam Houston was also part of this group with Andrew Jackson. And Houston, of course, led Texas to independence against Mexico, and was actually the president of independent Texas for a period of time. Sam Houston had lived with Cherokee Indians for 5 years. Very interesting fellow. March 27th, 1814 was the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The Tennessee militia against the Cherokee Indians. 2,000 American troops, including Cherokee Indians, against 800 Creek Indians. So this was a very bloody victory. It was a victory for the U.S., and 750 Creek Indians died. Only 49 Americans died. And this is the time when Jackson ended up adopting a Creek Indian orphan, Lincoya. Now, they were still trying to capture Red Eagle, and some days later, after that battle, Red Eagle, or William Weatherford, walked into the American Army camp to surrender and to speak with General Andrew Jackson. And Red Eagle said this, quote, "I ask nothing for myself, but I come to beg you to send for the women and children of the Creek Nation who are starving in the woods. Their fields, cabins, and corn cribs have been destroyed by your soldiers, who have driven them into the woods, where they have not so much as an ear of corn. I hope you will send perhaps parties of your men to relieve them. I will tell your men where they are. I am done fighting. The Red Sticks are almost all killed. If I could fight any longer, I would not be here. But please send for the women and children. They never did any harm. Now you can kill me if you like, or if the white people want me to be killed." Now, Jackson was really impressed by this speech and the fact that Red Eagle just walked in and surrendered on his own, and was really trying to work for the welfare of the women and children who were in dire straits at this time. And actually, even though Red Eagle was wanted, they wanted to capture him. Jackson had so much respect for him that he allowed him to go, and they did go and find these Indian women and children who were in need of help. As a result of the victory at Horseshoe Bend, Jackson was rewarded by President James Madison and became a major general in the U.S. Army with a command in the South. At this time, Florida was a Spanish colony. The British were using Pensacola, Florida, as a naval base, attacking in the war. So Jackson attacked and captured Pensacola in November of 1814. The British had been supplying Creek Indians with guns and ammunition in Florida to fight against the U.S. That fall of 1814, more talk of the British taking New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory. So by the fall, Jackson, with the Tennessee militia, was in New Orleans by December with the Louisiana militia. H.W. Brands wrote, quote, "What truly set Jackson apart from other generals was his ability to motivate his men. Many of them loved him. Nearly all of them feared him." Now, the American military forces in New Orleans were really a motley crowd, an assortment of different groups, including 200 black volunteers from Haiti. Haiti had been French Saint-Domingue and had political problems. A lot of people have been leaving Haiti because of the trouble there and war. January 8th, 1815 was a great day in American history and the greatest achievement in the life of Andrew Jackson. The Battle of New Orleans, which was a victory and electrified America. There were 10,000 British troops against 5,000 American troops. American troops included frontier riflemen who picked off the redcoats, the British soldiers. There were 2,600 British soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Only 8 Americans killed and 13 wounded. Tremendous victory. At that battle, the U.S. Army included Jean Lafitte's pirates. Jean Lafitte was the leader of a pirate gang or pirate group in New Orleans. And there were these Santo Domingo, or these free men of color, black fellows from Haiti, also Choctaw Indians and Tennessee backwoodsmen. Jackson said, quote, "It appears that the unerring hand of Providence shielded my men from the powers of balls, bombs, and rockets, when every ball and bomb from our guns carried with them the mission of death." Regarding these American riflemen, marksmen, David Nevin wrote, quote, "Tennessee marksmen, these were men who could nail a squirrel through the head, which mattered on the far frontier, because there is little enough meat on a squirrel, and a ball through the body often left none." Before the battle, Jackson was this inspirational leader, and he spoke to the troops. He said, quote, "All right, boys, we're going to take these sons of bitches down like we're chopping cotton." The men cheered that speech. Now, after the battle was over, there were so many British dead that even though the Americans were victorious, they were silent at this carnage. One of the worst defeats in the military defeats in the history of Great Britain. And Jackson got his a nickname, the Hero of New Orleans. Now, the battle was fought after the peace treaty of 1812 had been signed, but not before. And of course, actually, news had not arrived of the signing of the peace treaty, but it was not. It was before the British Parliament ratified the treaty, and so this was a significant victory. A new song was written afterwards, and it went like this: quote, "Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Andrew Jackson went to war and fed John Bull lead candy." Historian Robert Remini wrote about the War of 1812, quote, "In a real sense, the War of 1812 was part of a search for national identity, and in its aftermath, Andrew Jackson and his contemporaries seemed to sense that it had been found as a nation." Again, a major reason for the war was the British impressment, basically forcing men to serve in the British Navy, American sailors. One anecdote from the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson was looking to see the effect of his artillery fire on the British forces and said, quote, "Boys, elevate them guns a little lower." Historian David S. Reynolds wrote, quote, "The Treaty of Ghent ending the war with England was not finally ratified until February 1815. Had the British won the Battle of New Orleans, they would have been in a position to claim the southern Mississippi River Valley, which combined with their holdings to the north in Canada would have given them virtual control over large portions of America's vast western territory." Historian and Jackson biographer H.W. Brands wrote, quote, "The winter of 1814-1815 had been the darkest for America since the grim season of Valley Forge, as during that earlier crisis the very existence of the Republic was in danger. Federalists in Hartford, Connecticut plotted against the administration and perhaps against the Union, while a powerful British land and sea force prepared to invade the American South and slice the nation from bottom to top. Easterners, and especially visitors to Washington, where the blackened ruins of the Capitol and the White House stood starkly amid a heavy snowfall, couldn't imagine that the British might fail to defeat the motley regiments of a general who had bested Indians but never confronted a real army. One didn't have to be an alarmist to imagine that spring would find the United States disunited, with New England seceded, and the trans-Mississippi territories apportioned among the Europeans and Indians. 36 years after George Washington had kept the American Revolution alive on a bleak hillside near Philadelphia, the experiment in republicanism seemed on the verge of dissolution. And then, across the frozen fields and barren hopes of February, a blessed zephyr blew in from the south. Andrew Jackson had stood before New Orleans and defeated Wellington's Invincibles. The South was secure, and with it the West. And New England also, for the defeatism that fed the secessionist dreams of radical Federalists evaporated in the sudden glow of Jackson's triumph. Never had the mood of the nation changed so quickly from despair to confidence. The Republic survived. The Union was saved. That 1815, Jackson had ongoing health troubles really for most of his life, and from this point onward, he had dysentery, bad drinking water during his travels in the military, lead poisoning from bullets in his body, parasites also again from dirty drinking water. W.H. Brands wrote, quote, "Often the only thing that kept him upright, or bent over rather than prostrate, was his remarkable will. Jackson could not admit defeat to ill health no more readily than he could admit defeat to anything or anyone else." By April of 1815, Jackson was back in Nashville, Tennessee, and he said this, quote, "The sons of America, during a most eventful and perilous conflict, have approved themselves worthy of the precious inheritance bequeathed to them by their fathers. They have given a new proof how impossible it is to conquer free men fighting in defense of all that is dear to them. Henceforward we shall be respected by nations who, mistaking our character, had treated us with the utmost contempt and outrage. Years will continue to develop our inherent qualities, until from the youngest and weakest we shall become the most powerful nation in the universe." By 1817, Jackson was in command of American troops in the Seminole War in Florida. Florida, again, was a Spanish territory at this time, and slaves in the South were often escaping and traveling to Florida where they could be free and where they joined Seminole Indians. And then they'd come back crossing the border, the Seminole Indians and these free blacks, to steal horses and so forth. And for the slaves, they were getting revenge for the suffering they'd been through. Anyway, this was a problem. Jackson was ordered to go into Florida to fight the Seminole Indians and these former slaves, these free blacks in Florida. And when he achieved victory against them, and this led to the U.S. The Spanish realized they couldn't keep Florida, so they decided to sell Florida for $5 million. And this was controversial. He had some incidents with Spanish officials, and folks thought this was going to lead to war with Spain, but it did not. Jackson bragged that he'd never been to a foreign country, and when he was president, years later, the wife of one of his cabinet members, Peggy Eaton, mentioned Spanish Florida, which was a foreign land at the time. And then Peggy said, quote, "Oh, well, General, Florida didn't stay foreign long after you had been there." Again, his invasion and actions in Spanish Florida were controversial. However, he received full support from U.S. President James Monroe, who said, quote, "Florida was the theater of every lawless adventure. With little population of its own, the Spanish authority almost extinct, and the colonial government in a state of revolution, it was in a great measure derelict." The Spanish were fighting, trying to keep their colonies in Latin America, and they didn't have much time to pay attention to Florida. And of course, Jacksonville, Florida was named after Andrew Jackson for his role in Florida becoming part of the United States. Alexander Smythe, who was a politician during this time, said, quote, "Had Andrew Jackson lived before Homer sang, temples would have been raised to his honor. Altars would have been blazed, and he would have taken his stand with Hercules and Theseus among the immortals." By 1821, Jackson was provisional governor of the Florida Territory, and that summer he was in Pensacola for the turnover of Florida from Spain to the United States. However, after only a few months, he wanted to resign. He sent a letter to President James Monroe resigning as Florida governor, and he said, quote, "I am truly wearied of public life. I want rest, and my private concerns imperiously demand my attention. I should retire to resuscitate my declining fortune, to enable it to support me in my declining years." By 1823, Jackson had been elected to the U.S. Senate again. Then by 1824 was another presidential election, and Jackson was a very strong candidate for the presidency based on primarily his success in defeating the British in New Orleans, along with defeating the Indians at Horseshoe Bend, Alabama, and in Florida. And another contender was John Quincy Adams, who was... and John Quincy Adams said about Jackson, he called him, quote, "a barbarian who could not write a sentence of grammar and hardly could spell his own name." John Quincy Adams really was an intellectual. He didn't have much. He had very little respect for Andrew Jackson. Of course, they were rivals for the presidency. During this time, 1824, Jackson said, quote, "I cannot be intimidated from doing that which my judgment and conscience tells me is right by any earthly power." Now, in 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette was visiting Washington. Remember, he'd been a French volunteer fighting in the American Revolution, became very close with George Washington, and Jackson met him. Lafayette was an older man. In the election, presidential election, Andrew Jackson received the most votes for president. However, not enough to in the Electoral College, not enough to win, because it was split among several candidates, including Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay. And so the matter had to be decided by the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay used his influence. And John Quincy Adams, even though he received significantly fewer votes than Jackson, became president. So this was really controversial, and people were upset because Jackson really should have won that election. And then to make things really bad, after Clay used his influence, Henry Clay, for John Quincy Adams to win the presidency, and then shortly thereafter, John Quincy Adams named Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, which is the top position in government after the presidency, and the stepping stone at that time to the presidency. So this was considered a corrupt bargain, and really it was very unfortunate. Jackson should have been president. This really destroyed Henry Clay's career people thought, it really hurt his reputation. And it actually meant that John Quincy Adams was a very unpopular president as well, and ineffective. Andrew Jackson said after this happened, quote, "The Judas of the West," he's calling Henry Clay Judas, "the Judas of the West, has closed the contract and will receive the 30 pieces of silver. His end will be the same." Referring to Judas who betrayed Jesus Christ. 1825, Jackson still had his home, the Hermitage, and a big land. He owned 80 slaves in 1825 and was growing corn and cotton at his farm. He had during Lafayette's visit. Well, no, actually later. Pistols that had been given by Lafayette to George Washington were given to Andrew Jackson by the Washington family because they had respect for him. Now, there are many visitors to the Hermitage to see the famous Andrew Jackson, including Julia Connor, who said, quote, "The manners of the general are so perfectly easy and polished, and those of his wife so replete with kindness and benevolence, that you are placed at once at ease." Andrew Jackson was a charming man. He could turn enemies into friends with his charm. 1828 in June, his adopted Indian son Lincoya died at age 16 of tuberculosis. Very, very tragic. So he lost his son Lincoya. 1828 was another presidential election, and Jackson won big. And this is when he was elected the 7th U.S. president. It was a very nasty election. A lot of terrible things were said. Jackson was called a murderer for his duels. One terrible claim was that Jackson's mother had been a prostitute. And then there was this anti-Jackson song, oh Andy, how many men have you hanged in your life? How many weddings make a wife?" Talking about he hung men in his military service who were judged guilty of mutiny and insubordination. And of course, he had married his wife twice because of confusion about her marital status. In the election, Adams received 178 electoral votes. John Quincy Adams only 83. So it was a decisive victory for Jackson. This was the first time a president was not from Virginia or an Adams, John Adams or John Quincy Adams. Again, in the election, all these attacks had been made on him, and Jackson said, quote, "Truth is mighty and shall prevail." In the popular vote, Jackson received 647,000 votes. John Quincy Adams, 508,000. People like to criticize him as being uneducated, illiterate, which really wasn't true. He could mispronounce words, and his spelling wasn't great, but a lot of people's spelling wasn't great back then. Jackson was criticized for pronouncing the word development as development. Another interesting thing is John C. Calhoun, who had been John Quincy Adams' vice president, continued on and was the vice president of Andrew Jackson. Regarding his political enemies in 1828, Jackson said, quote, "Should the uncircumcised Philistines send forth their Goliath to destroy the liberty of the people and compel them to worship Mammon, they may find a David who trusts in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Jacob. For when I fight, it is the battles of my country." Yes, it's a nice biblical reference to Goliath and David and Goliath. In 1828, more states were allowing individual votes for president rather than the state legislatures deciding. There were 1 million voters in 1828, 4 times that of 1824, and property qualifications were being removed for voting rights. So our country was becoming more democratic. Now, the power behind the campaign was Martin Van Buren, who was in the process of creating the modern Democratic Party, and he was tireless in his efforts through newspapers and promoting the Jackson campaign, distribution of campaign badges, books, and pamphlets. Martin Van Buren was the master organizer in the campaign. December 22nd, shortly after the election, Jackson's beloved wife, Rachel, died because of the terrible stress of the campaign. Regarding the White House, she had said, quote, "I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than to live in that place." She had no ambition to be First Lady. She enjoyed a simple life. She did not want to be First Lady. She was buried in the garden at the Hermitage on Christmas Eve. Andrew Jackson, this was devastating to him. He'd had lost his family growing up, and she was everything to him. She was such a wonderful person, very kind, and such a wonderful wife. He said, quote, "I can and do forgive all my enemies, but those vile wretches who have slandered her must look to God for mercy." After her death, Jackson said, quote, oh yes, we're all nothing but poor creatures anyhow. No matter what we gain, there's always some loss that takes it all away. Rachel was murdered by slanders that pierced her heart. May God Almighty forgive her murderers, as I know she forgave them. I never can. Another time, Jackson was talking shortly after Rachel's death, and he said, quote, "Could I but withdraw from the scenes around me to the private walks of the Hermitage, how soon would I be found in the solitary shades of my garden, at the tomb of my wife, there to spend my days in silent sorrow, and in peace from the toils and strife of this world. Oh, how fluctuating are all earthly things! At the time I least expected it, and could least spare her, she was snatched from me, and I left here a solitary monument of grief, without the least hope of happiness here below." Years later, Margaret Truman, the daughter of U.S. President Harry Truman, who became a historian herself, she wrote, quote, "There is no doubt that Rachel Jackson, wife of President Andrew Jackson, was murdered by the nation's newspapers before she even reached the White House." Rachel had been called an American Jezebel. Jezebel was this famous evil woman from the Bible, a convicted adulteress and a profligate woman. It was bringing up the stuff about how the fact she had been married twice, and when they thought she was divorced when she married Andrew, and so this was very, very terrible politics, and she was really hurt by it, and it played all these terrible things that were said about her really played a major role in her death. So Andrew Jackson, in his moment of triumph, becoming U.S. president, lost his wife. So this was a devastating, and he had to become. Still, life goes on. He had to head off to Washington to be inaugurated in March of 1829. Jackson became the first president to take the oath of office on the east front of the U.S. Capitol. He had tuberculosis. He had bullets in his body. He was in poor health. He was 61 years old and mourning the loss of his beloved wife, Rachel. His son, his adopted son, Andrew Donaldson, was his personal assistant, and Andrew Donaldson's wife, Emily, served as the White House hostess since Rachel Jackson had died. In his inaugural address, Andrew Jackson said, quote, "The federal Constitution must be obeyed, state rights preserved, our national debt must be paid, direct taxes and loans avoided, and the federal union preserved. These are the objects I have in view, and regardless of all consequences will carry into effect." After his inauguration, there was a big party at the White House. Lots of people, the common people, had been traveling from all over. Poor people had been coming for the inauguration and this inaugural party at the White House. Margaret Bayard Smith was a historian, and she wrote a lot about, during her lifetime, about what she saw in Washington City. And she wrote, quote, "But what a scene we did witness. The majesty of the people had disappeared, and a rabble, a mob, of boys, Negroes, women, children, scrambling, fighting, romping. What a pity, what a pity. No arrangements had been made, no police officers placed on duty, and the whole house had been inundated by the rabble mob. We came too late. the president, after having been literally nearly pressed to death and almost suffocated and torn to pieces by the people in their eagerness to shake hands with Old Hickory, had retreated through the back way or south front and had escaped to his lodgings at Gadsby's. So this large crowd of people who came jammed the White House with muddy boots. They climbed on silk chairs. Fists flew, china crashed, and ladies fainted in this chaotic inaugural party. His supporters included tough frontiersmen, the common people. His victory was seen as a defeat of aristocracy. Now, they tried this. The White House was just jammed with people, so they were trying to get the people out. There was just too many people, and so they put cake, ice cream, and punch outside on the lawn to try to get the people to leave the White House, which they did. The Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story called this, quote, "the reign of King Mob." And this is when the Democratic Party got its name. Earlier, it had been called the Republican Party, no relation to the modern Republican Party, which came years later during the time of Abraham Lincoln. And President Jackson fired the most government workers of any president and replaced them with supporters. 919 government workers lost their jobs and were replaced, 10% of the government employees. Outgoing President John Quincy Adams said, quote, "A large portion of the population of Washington are dependent for bread upon these offices. Everyone is in breathless expectation, trembling at heart, afraid to speak." Jackson believed that this was corruption, these people expecting government jobs forever, and he said, quote, "Government office is considered as a species of property, and government rather as a means of promoting individual interests than as an instrument created solely for the service of the people." And in the shakeup of government jobs, there was a postmaster in danger of losing his job. He had been a war veteran and lost a leg serving in battle. They said that he voted against Jackson, and Jackson responded, quote, "If he lost a leg fighting for his country, that's vote enough for me." Jackson appointed an old friend, Jack Dade, to be superintendent of the Washington City Penitentiary. So when he appeared on the job, Dade they gathered all the inmates who were assembled, and he spoke to them, and he said, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, no, that won't do. Fellow citizens, no, you've forfeited your right to that. Well, anyway, you people listen. As long as you behave yourselves, you'll be well treated. But any devilment, and I'll turn every damn one of you out." Now, Jackson was a very strong, active president. The first 6 presidents had vetoed a total of 9 bills. Jackson vetoed 12 himself, so double the previous 6 presidents. He expanded presidential power, which led to the strong presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, at this time, there was just the one party. The old Federalist Party had died out, and you just had this new the Democratic Party, which had been around since Jefferson's time. And an opposition party was formed specifically in opposition to Andrew Jackson, called the Whig Party. It was formed by Henry Clay, who was his principal opponent, along with Daniel Webster, the Whig Party. So this meant we had the 2 parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. It appears we're out of time. This concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time with Andrew Jackson, Part 3. I hope you have a good history book to read or find one. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray, at peterjray.com. And you also might consider checking out our podcast, Adventures in History, which you can listen to on Spotify, Breaker, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care. And I'll see you next time.